May 27th, John Calvin, Reformer of the Church, 1564. One might ask, what is this continental French reformer doing on our Anglican church calendar? Well, whether one likes it or not, to deny Calvin's impact on the development of Anglicanism would constitute historical revisionism of the highest order. From around the 1560s to the 1620s, the Church of England adopted what might be called a moderate Calvinism. In their good desire to reform the excesses of the late medieval church, the English bishops of the 16th century denounced the authority of Rome and looked instead to the continental Reformation for inspiration. They emphasized God's sovereignty in salvation, they stripped churches of all images and ornaments, and they reduced ceremonial to a bare minimum. Nevertheless, the English church of the 16th century didn't go all the way in accepting Calvin's double predestination, nor did she abandon the historic succession of bishops and priests. Later on in the 17th century, the bishops and theologians under Charles I and II, called the Caroline Divines, led something of a corrective against the Calvinism of the previous generation. Instead of looking first to the continental reformers, the Carolines looked back to the consensus of the church fathers, recovering a more balanced soteriology, a revival of the sacramental worldview, and a restoration of beauty in liturgy and ceremonial. What emerged out of this internal counter-reformation was neither Roman Catholicism nor continental Protestantism, but a reformed English Catholicism that benefited from the insights of the Reformation, but retained a clear continuity with the ancient undivided church in her polity, liturgy, and sacramental life. Now we must acknowledge, even if reluctantly, that Calvin played a role in the emergence of this uniquely Anglican identity. Now, setting aside for a moment Calvin's singular understanding of predestination, how might Christians today, and especially Reformed evangelicals, benefit from reading Calvin himself? A few thoughts. Firstly, Calvin engages with the church fathers. Granted, a couple of times in his Institutes, he says that only Augustine got it right with regard to certain things. But nevertheless, he knows and engages with Chrysostom and Jerome and many others. So if you call yourself Reformed or a Calvinist, you should follow your leader and read the church fathers too. Secondly, Calvin accords the highest degree of importance to the Christian's mystical union with Christ. He writes, "We do not, therefore, contemplate him outside ourselves from afar, in order that his righteousness may be imputed to us, but because we put on Christ and are grafted into his body, in short, because he deigns to make us one with him." It's beautiful. Thirdly, and related to this, Calvin espouses what modern evangelicals would call a high view of the sacraments. For him, baptism and the Lord's Supper are not bare symbols, but efficacious means of grace, gifts of God to his people, joining us to Christ and sustaining us in him. So Calvin engages with the fathers, he emphasizes mystical union with Christ, and he has a high sacramental theology. Ironically, reading Calvin himself might just knock contemporary Reformed evangelicals onto the trajectory of embracing the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith.